Welcome to Trust Talk. In this episode, we are joined by Adam Seligman, professor of religion at Boston University, to explore the vital distinction between trust and confidence and how religious communities have historically fostered trust, even across faiths. Adam delves into how Muslims, Christians, and Jews once shared sacred spaces and rituals, fostering a trust that transcended religious boundaries, a practice he believes is now under threat. We also discuss the dangers of religion's growing entanglement with politics, and how this impacts trust in our increasingly divided world. Tune in for a rich conversation about trust, religion, and society in today's complex landscape. Your host, Severin DeWitt.
Adam, welcome to Trust Talk. When I first thought of inviting you, it was to explore the relationship between trust and religion. Then I found out you wrote a book back in 1997 called The Problem of Trust. And then it became clear to me that your work spans a much broader range of topics. So I think there's a lot to talk about. So let's dive in. Trust is often thought of as similar to confidence. You make a distinction between trust and confidence. How do you see these two concepts differing from one another?
We use them almost as synonyms, but the distinction was posited by the sociologist Niklas Luhmann. He first made this distinction between trust and confidence as a useful heuristic. In other words, they're ideal types. Nothing is ever totally one or the other. But he made a distinction that I think is extremely useful between confidence, which is what we have when we know what to expect, when we believe we can predict. We might be wrong, right? We might be wrong, but we think we can predict outcomes. And that prediction can be based on various things. It can be based on sanctions, either formal sanctions or informal sanctions. If you bought my car and your check bounces, I can take you to court. That's a formal sanction. So probably you'll make sure you have money in the bank when you write me the check. If the plumber does a terrible job in plumbing, he knows that I'm going to tell everybody in my church or my neighborhood that he's a bad plumber. That's an informal sanction. So sanctions are one basis of confidence, ability to predict outcomes. Another one, which is much closer to our concerns today, is familiarity. We're the same, or I can tell a story about us being the same. You played soccer as a kid in the street, and I played soccer as a kid in the street, so we share the same moral assumptions, the same notions of fair play. We have a shared background, so I can say you're like me, so I know how you're going to act. Of course, I don't, right? As I said, we could be wrong, but that's confidence. Trust, on the other hand, is what we need to maintain interaction if we do not have a basis of confidence. It's the ability to get beyond the structures of confidence, to kind of walk into the unknown, to be willing to take risks. Trust is a way of negotiating risk, not danger. If I think what's facing me is a dangerous situation or a potentially dangerous situation, I will make the necessary adjustments so I will not be in danger. Trust deals with a much more ambiguous set of circumstances, which we can call risk.
Well, this is a nice one to start. As I said in the beginning, the original subject I wanted to talk with you about, because you're a professor of religion at Boston University, is the relationship between trust and religion. So how do you see these two concepts relating to each other? How do religious communities help people trust each other, even if they don't know one another personally?
I'm a professor of religion, but I'm really a defrocked sociologist. Just to say that, just to put that out there. So I think that religion or religious communities help foster trust in two ways. One, they provide a basis of confidence. We go to the same church. We've gone to the same church for 20 years. If we're living where we grew up, maybe our parents also went to the same church. So we share a basis of confidence. From that, we can move to trust. Trust does not exist just in the air. I think you need a basis of confidence in order to trust. So one thing that religious communities provide are a basis of confidence predicated on familiarity, on shared rituals, on shared practices, on shared beliefs or assumed shared beliefs, and so on. But I think religious practice, being oriented towards transcendence in whatever religion we want, provides a basis of trust in a different way. It constitutes the self. Being oriented to transcendence initiates a vertical dimension in our existence beyond the horizontal existence. The horizontal axis is our relation to other people in the church community, in work, and wherever we happen to be. The orientation of what we're calling religion, which is an orientation to transcendence, posits another axis of existence, a vertical axis, and that allows one to step outside the sometimes comforting and sometimes wrong truths and assumptions of community, right? What Bacon called the idols of the tribe. And so it constitutes the self in a way that you can have the courage. You can. It's a potential. Nothing is guaranteed by a long shot. It has the potential to allow you to step outside those comforting truths, because you're constituted not just by those around you, your kin groups, your community, your church, your synagogue, your people, your nation, what have you, but you're constituted by something else as well, as I call it, that vertical axis. And that can give you the strength, the power to trust, to make that leap outside of confidence.
In many parts of the Western world, we are seeing a decline in interest and participation in religion. Given this trend, do you think religion can still play a role in building the trust that you just mentioned?
Well, I think that we're in a very unfortunate circumstance today where religious communities and religious beliefs are more and more firmly intertwined with a very particular type of political orientation that tends to be ethnocentric, which tends to be nationalistic, xenophobic. And we see the merger of religious beliefs with, from my view, a very frightening politics in many places in the world. We see it in Israel, we see it in America, we see it in India, we see it in parts of Poland, clearer before the last elections. So we see it in Russia. So I think this is a very dangerous development that's very much contemporary. If we think of the end of the 19th century, and I don't want to romanticize it, but if you look at the Ottoman Empire, let's say, people of different religious communities shared shrines. Christians and Muslims, Jews and Muslims would share sacred places throughout the Balkans and North Africa. The Israeli practice of mimouna after Passover originated in Morocco, where Muslim non-Jews gave the Jewish people the first leaven that they ate after Passover. Jews would approach the Muslims in Ramadan at night and give them their first bread to eat. People shared shrines. You have remnants of that today. There's a wonderful documentary, short anthropological documentary called Shared Shrines by Elizabetha Koneska, which is about a shrine in northern Macedonia that everybody goes to. Different Muslim sects, different Christian sects, they take down the cross, they put down the picture of the sheikh, they take down the picture of the sheikh, they put if they're Bektashi, and they put up a verse from the Quran. If they're Sunni, different Christians use it as well. So there was this ability to move beyond, to maintain the boundaries of one religious community, but cross the boundary as well. Today we've lost that ability, and I think to our detriment and great danger.
Like you mentioned, trust seems to be deeply intertwined with shared beliefs and communal identity, but we also see how religion can become a source of division and conflict. Just look at what we are happening today in the Middle East. In a world where religious clashes seem to intensify mistrust, do you think religion still holds the potential to foster trust across different faiths?
I think it holds the potential, but we need a very strong telescope. You mentioned the Middle East. It's a very good example. I lived in Israel for 20 years. When I lived there, it was very clear to everybody that the conflict was a conflict between two people over the same piece of territory, over the same land. In the last 20 years, 30 years, that conflict has been infused with religious meanings that it didn't have in the 1960s and 1970s and 1980s. Yeah, Arafat was not Nasrallah. Arafat was not Sinwar. Yeah, the PLO was a secular revolutionary organization. It wasn't a religious sect. So the conflict has changed and become a religious conflict where compromise is almost, and same thing from the Jewish perspective. Same thing from the Jewish perspective. The secular Zionism has, for better or for worse, whatever it was, that's a different discussion, has turned into a religious perception, which is frightening. And this has happened in different places of the world as well, similar developments. So I'm actually pessimistic, because when you infuse religious meanings, religious commitments, religious beliefs, religious intensity, religious charisma into ethno-national movements, the result is frightening. We're seeing that sadly today.
Which also affects trust among those holding these different religions, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I looked at a short BBC film, news report yesterday, interviews with Palestinians in the West Bank and Israelis. And they said very, very clearly, we don't trust the other. After this, we cannot trust. After this, we cannot trust. It's exactly that. Exactly that.
Terrible. Anyway, I want to move on to the book that you wrote. It's a little while ago, The Problem of Trust. You talk about how we've come to rely on a kind of trust where we believe others will act in good faith, even if we don't know them well. This kind of trust is riskier because we are counting on people to be honest and responsible without always having common backgrounds or strict rules to keep them in check. Do you think this kind of trust is still strong enough to hold society together, or does it leave us more open to broken trust?
No, I don't think trust per se is strong enough to hold society together. I think we need a shared basis of confidence from which, at moments of grace, we can jump into trust. Martin Buber developed this notion of the difference between I, it, and I, thou. And the I, thou is the trusting relation, and it cannot last all the time. We have to go back always to confidences.
For our non-English speakers, what is the I, thou?
Ich du, and ich ding, yeah? And we can't stay there. We can't stay in that moment. So what I said in the beginning, we can jump from confidence to trust, but the daily life has to be predicated on confidence, and that basis is getting more and more restricted, certainly in the country I'm living in the United States, among other things as a result of social media. So people no longer share a world of meanings. They no longer share a world of assumptions. They're broken up into endless different small groups. So there isn't a basis of confidence from which we could move into trust. And I think that's, again, that's connected to the rise of a certain politics in the United States, and not just in the United States.
In your book, you talk about how the increasing complexity of social roles creates gaps where trust is really needed for people to connect and work together. Can you explain how this growing complexity makes trust more important beyond just relying on a set of norms or rules?
I warned you that I'm really a sociologist, because this is based on a kind of esoteric aspect of sociological role theory that was developed in the 60s and 70s of the last century, which is just that, to simplify, that the more social roles we have as father and son and professor and consumer and the golf partner and so on, the more we have the ability to hide different aspects of what we do from those people with whom we're in the role relationship.
I guess you have to explain that a little bit.
I'll give another similar example first. As a professor, the demands on me are both to be an administrator, to be a teacher, and to be a researcher. They're contradictory because there are only so many hours in a day, And I also have a family. Now my children are grown up and they're out of the house. But at one point, I had to be all those three things and also a father to two young girls. And also sleep at least 6 hours a night. Not to mention take care of my elder aging mother in the same house. So there's just a limit to what you can do. So naturally, I think you don't fulfill all the expectations in all the roles because you cannot. And then you can hide, you have the ability to hide certain aspects. I tell my wife that I'm working late because I have to prepare whatever committee meeting next week, but I'm actually going out drinking with the boys or with the girls for that matter, if it so happens. So the more complex society is, the more complex the different roles we play in society. Compare this to a relatively non-differentiated society of hunter-gatherers or simple agricultural society or a small village, even in Holland today, a small village. It's still, you have less roles than you do in Utrecht or in, Amsterdam and in whatever job you're playing. So because there is a greater ability to hide, to cheat, to change, and so on, to develop a private, trust is more necessary because you don't have the knowledge necessary for confidence.
You talk about the divide between our private and public lives elsewhere, and I think also in the book, and how personal freedom in the private sphere impacts trust in the public space. How do you think this emphasis on individual autonomy affects trust in society as a whole, and what might be the political consequences of this change?
So that's a very important question, and I hope I could answer it properly. But confidence is based on what is. I know what is, so I know what to predict. Again, I might be wrong, but I think I know. Trust is not based on what is, it's based on what could be. In a way, it's generative. It can build a future. It might fail, but it can build a future. Trust necessitates an opening, a willingness not to be in control. I said in the very beginning that it's a response to risk. I'm willing to take a risk. It means I'm not in control, not physically and not cognitively. Being willing to take a risk, being willing not to be into control, being willing to not subjugate everything to my pre-existing categories necessitates a certain degree of humility on my part, to be willing to be in such a position, a certain degree of humility in regard to my truth claims. This humility can allow something new to come to be. That's why I call it generative. I'm reining in, as it were, we all are. In trust, we rein in our natural proclivity to impose our meanings on the world, impose our desires on the world, impose our understandings on the world. I'm listening to your understanding. I'm open to you. Something new can come out of this openness. Something new can come to be between us and more generally, of course, this can be scaled up. I think the political consequences of this can be significant. I really believe they can be significant.
And so how do you translate that into what I asked, the private and the public lives?
So I think that this has the potential of transforming aspects of public life. This openness, this humility, this being willing not to impose myself and hence to let something unknown be. This can change public life. We're doing that. We really are doing that in the NGO that I've been directing for 25 years now, in Japan, in Africa, East Africa, in different places, Indonesia, and different places. This is CEDAR, the Communities Engaging with Difference in Religion, that do programs precisely predicated on this. So it's small scale, but it's exactly about translating this, making trust public. And for instance, in Kenya, we're training community organizers. There are 400 community organizers in Kenya, and they're slowly going through training in the program. So an attempt to affect the public realm, which suffers from intermittent horrific violence in Kenya every time after elections, on the basis of this potential to something new. That's how I think it can prove. So it's a long, complicated process, but it can be done.
Let's cover a completely different subject. in your article, The Tragedy of Human Rights, co-written with David Montgomery, you argue that making human rights the main way we express our shared moral vision leaves out other important aspects of human fulfillment, especially a sense of shared belonging. Can you explain why you believe this focus on human rights might limit our ability to build a strong community, and why this idea has sparked controversy?
So it sparked controversy because some people anyway, think that I'm making an argument against human rights, that it's a bad thing. I never said that, never wrote that. I just claimed that it's an insufficient good upon which to predicate human society, that we have other needs, other goods. And as you say, one of the ones that I think is terrifically important is the need to belong. So one of the problems with human rights is that it privileges, way beyond everything else, the individual, which is a very Western concept. Again, if you go all over Africa and China and many places in the world, you'll find that the individual is not so privileged, and that it's maybe not a bad thing, that the individual is always an individual within community and part of community and cannot be thought outside of community, a community of belonging. So we in the West often treat human rights as something sacred, as something that cannot be questioned, criticized, as the ultimate human good. And I think it's a necessary aspect of society, absolutely. We have laws that are necessary, but it's not the only good. And when that good of rights, which privileges, as I said, the individual, when it's in conflict with other goods, and I'll give you an example in a minute, certainly people from other communities have no right. They lack the skills to adjudicate. I'll give you an example. In the wars following the Lord's Resistance Army in northern Uganda, the International Criminal Court came in and wanted to try and then find guilty and punish individuals involved in war crimes. Many of these individuals were 12 to 14 years old when they were abducted and forced to be turned into killers. The communities, on the other hand, wanted to integrate them into the community and reintegrate them. And they had ways to reintegrate them, because for them, what had to be realized was not individual punishment, but how we build a community again. How do we live together again? So it's different ideas of what justice is, different idea of the goods involved in human well-being. The West, of course, has the resources to impose its will, but that's often done unwisely.
Adam, as we wrap up, I'm curious, looking back on your academic career, is there anything you regret not covering in your work? So let's say, and if you were half your age and had another 100 more years to explore, what topic or issue would fascinate you most to dive into and write about?
I have so many regrets that I won't go into those, but I'll only answer the second half of the question, if I may. So the last major project that I wrote was on oaths and vows. And that led me to what I'm beginning to look at now, which is the difference between worshiping only with words and also the use of images, which, of course, is prevalent in Catholicism, for instance. Icons, especially in the Eastern Church. And I say this, a friend of mine and colleague and co-author, Robert Weller, with whom I wrote 3 books, realized, he said to me and explained, and he was right. He says, Adam, you write a book sort of not to explain things to anybody else. You write it to explain to yourself, to figure out for yourself a problem. And of course, every book that I write that figures out, in my lights, answers the question, always leads up to another question, which then becomes the other book. And that's been going on for many, many years now. But if I had 100 years, if I was half my age, if I was just beginning now, I would totally leave the Problemstellung that I've been dealing with for my whole academic career. And I think I have kind of some beginning of an understanding of events in the West and the gestalt of Western, what we call civilization. And if I had that time, I would learn Chinese or I would learn Sanskrit, and I would enter into an inquiry into a totally different human experience. That's what I would do if I had the time.
Well, Adam, I wish you all that 100 years. I'm not sure whether that works out,
No.
but I certainly wish it to you. Thank you very much to be our guest today, and I wish you all the best and another happy many years.
Thank you very, very much. I appreciate this. Thank you. It was fun.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Trust Talk. We hope that you found the conversation valuable and informative. At Trust Talk, we believe in the power of trust to create positive change in the world. If you believe in our mission, we would greatly appreciate your support. You can help keep Trust Talk going by making a donation on our website at trusttalk.co/donate. Every contribution, no matter how small, helps us to continue bringing you thoughtful and engaging podcasts. Thank you for your support and for listening to Trust Talk. We look forward to meeting you again for future episodes.